And we'll be continuing with more sights of the city. We'll continue our walking tour and see the museums and more of the shops and cafes of this great, beautiful city. And then we meet again the next morning for yet another walking tour conducted by myself. Of course, you want to go shopping, and we're going to get you shopping, right? That's a top priority for today, I'm sure. The leather goods of Florence are fabulous, as you know. So we're going to be taking you in the direction of the leather factories again. Back to that Peruzzi leather factory. On the way, we can stop off at a couple of very interesting sites. Just briefly, we'll take a look at the church that's right here in our neighborhood, Santa Maria Novella. It should be open by now, and there are several very important art masterpieces inside. It's one of the places where Michelangelo learned how to paint, and we'll see some of the works that he assisted on by Ghirlandaio and Masaccio on the walls in the church. And from there, I'm going to head to the Bargello Museum, which is just about at the leather factory. That's the National Museum of Sculpture, primarily. And you're welcome to come into the museum if you'd like to for maybe a brief visit, 20, 30 minutes. I'm sure there's a Michelangelo sculpture inside there. And then for those of you who don't even want to go to the Bargello, fine. We'll just point you around the corner, and the leather factory's around the corner. Let's heli on down the stairs and get on our way. We're having a stroll through the streets heading for Piazza Santa Maria Novella, and we're going to be looking at some of the great museums of the city in this episode. We'll be in the Bargello Museum, but first we'll start out with a look at a very ancient and very interesting old church that you see here with its graceful Renaissance facade. Let me take you inside and tell you all about it. Santa Maria Novella is one of the very earliest of the Renaissance. In fact, it's before the Renaissance in its origins. It's a Gothic church, and then was later continued to be decorated and evolved into the earliest of the Renaissance period. And the basic structure of the building is definitively Gothic, Florentine Gothic. This is the high chapel. It's behind the high altar of Santa Maria Novella. And behind me, you see the masterpiece of Ghirlandaio. He was a fresco painter of the late 15th century. And as I mentioned, this is one of the places where Michelangelo learned how to paint. Michelangelo was a young assistant working here on this project. You see the tremendous sense of depth and perspective, of folds of the garments. And naturally, it illustrates the different scenes from the Bible. There's the presentation of the Virgin, and it gives you a fairly good idea of what life was like in Florence in the late 15th century. This is almost like a snapshot of people's clothing, of the kinds of houses they lived in, the kinds of beds they slept in, what the streets were like. So the people of the time were largely illiterate. They couldn't read the Bible, and instead they would be taught the principles of the Bible here by looking. It's almost like a comic book with the illustrated pictures to illustrate the lessons. And you see this tremendous illusion of three-dimensionality, not just in the overall structure, but on the walls. We have the sculpture, the trompe-l'oeil sculpture of the little cupids on the walls, painted in that monochrome again, where you really don't know if it's a sculpture or a painting. And it's really, really quite a sight here by Ghirlandaio, right up to the ceiling. And on both sides. The whole chapel here is done by the master. The stained glass window is from the 15th century. Many artistic innovations are found at Santa Maria Novella, including the two scrolls on the facade you'll see here that join the top level and the bottom level of the front of the church. That's the first time that such scrolls were used, and they became quite prevalent later in the Renaissance. Walking through the arcades of Piazza della Repubblica to the famous coffee shop of Gilli. This is one of the finest cafes in the city. Fairly elegant spot, and yet if you stand up and have your coffee, it's the same price as any place else in the country, about 80 cents for a small espresso. But treat yourself to some wonderful fresh pastries here at Gilli's. After this refreshing break, we soon admire more of the classic works of art in this great city. Inside the Bargello Museum, the National Museum of Sculpture, you see Giambologna's Mercury there. The Bargello specializes in sculpture rather than painting, and it contains the Cellini's Mercury for comparison with Giambologna's. There's some large muscular bronzes, there's marbles, there's several pieces by Michelangelo. He carved this rounded three-dimensional relief of the Virgin and Child in 1504, and his Drunken Bacchus of 1497 is also here. The Bargello does contain the finest collection of Italian Renaissance sculptures from the 15th and 16th century, and therefore it can be reasoned that it contains the finest sculptures in the history of the world. The Drunken Bacchus is Michelangelo's very first statue, his first freestanding three-dimensional piece, and it was carved on his first visit to Rome in 1497. We're now in the Bargello Museum, which is the National Museum of Sculpture in Florence, and it has a very rich collection, including pieces by Michelangelo and by Sansovino. There's Ghiberti, there's Brunelleschi, Giambologna. There's 3 floors. It's a former castle that was a former prison. There used to be executions here in the courtyard. What you see behind me is a well today. Before it was a scaffolding for capital punishment, high crimes and misdemeanors, and the bell would toll. So we're going to have a stroll through the Bargello and enjoy the beautiful statues of the Renaissance of Florence. The most famous statue in the museum is Donatello's David. This was the first freestanding nude sculpture to be created in over 1,000 years. St. George by Donatello is an example of the earliest sculpture of the Renaissance, for Donatello stands at the transition between the late Gothic and the early Renaissance, and there are numerous pieces by Donatello also in the Bargello. The works here have a tender and subtle grace which is difficult to put into words. It really must be experienced, especially amongst the soaring Gothic vaults of this incredible setting of the Bargello, a former palace, a former prison, and now containing the finest sculpture in the history of Western art. After such a stimulating experience, you want to just throw yourself back into the streets and back into the hustle bustle of the shops and restaurants and have a break, have some ice cream, do a little bit of more mundane pursuits, and let your mind absorb those great tranquil works that you've just been experiencing.